Hey everybody, we're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. As ever, I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
We're back with our continuing Immigrant Awareness Month coverage, and it's been a doozy so far. Folks, if you're watching along with our recommendations and discussions, we have certainly had a lot of anger, had some tears, and learned a heck of a lot. We were originally supposed to cover a Netflix documentary for this week called Born in Syria. We watched this documentary. We decided we weren't quite happy with it, which we'll get into in a little bit. And we then went down the internet rabbit holes and found a much better second choice, which is called Cries From Syria and is a 2017 documentary that is on HBO Max. And the guts of this documentary is really the most comprehensive and detailed timeline of the modern conflict in Syria, which a lot of people are calling the Syrian civil war, primarily between anti-Assad regime forces. Then we get lots of different kinds of terrorist groups mixed in there in an alphabet soup of conflict that happens. So anti-Assad regime, Islamic militants, and the Assad regime forces are pretty much the three large categories of combatants in this conflict. And, we wanted to talk about the Syrian refugee crisis because fleeing war is probably the top reason why people immigrate in the first place and migrate around the world. And they've been doing it for forever. And this documentary does get to the refugee crisis at the end, towards the end, and follows a lot of the reasons why. But the reason we think this documentary is so important to do all of this background research is to understand what forced these people to leave and that they didn't want to. I think that's one of the things that I took away. So I took away a lot of things from this documentary, but one of the core things was how much the Syrian people love Syria and how much they love their country and how much they didn't want to leave. But they had no other choice. And this doc, and I don't say that like, I was going to say they perceived that they had no other choice, but that does them a disservice. They had no other choice. If they stayed, they died, or their sons got, indoctrinated by ISIS or any other number of horrors. And so to understand refugees and why they seek security and comfort and peace and stability and life elsewhere, this documentary does such a fantastic job of showing, specifically in the case of Syria, what horrors you face before you make that decision. And really, it shows you the level of love that they had for their country, that it took so many of them that long to leave. Because it started the way back in 2011 on the wave of the Arab Spring that started in 2010, and that the majority of them started leaving in 2015 and 2016, I think is a testament to how much they wanted to try and stay and save what was happening to their beloved country. But as I just stated in my recap, we cannot recommend this documentary enough. We're going to go through some of the lessons and takeaways we got from it and discuss why it was so much more important and better done than the Born in Syria, in our opinions. But if you've got an hour and 47 minutes to sit with a Syrian civil war, this is the place to go.
Experts have said this is the humanitarian crisis of our time, and they're still saying it throughout COVID. So I know there are two images from the Syrian civil war I think that most humans have seen. One is the body of a 3-year-old child washed up on the shores in Greece, and the other is a child sitting in the back of an ambulance covered in ash from being in a bomb. And every conflict has iconic images. That's one of the ways that we tell stories of conflict, as images. The reason I actually started working in Northern Ireland was because I saw an image from the Troubles. So images are very powerful. Mm-hmm. And this documentary opens with video footage of the little boy's body on the beach. And that sets you up. This is where we're going. This is where we are. Brief history that we got from the video, but again, we would encourage you to watch it yourselves. The war itself started in 2011. The journey to this war started in 1963. And the first time, and then in 1971, a guy named Hafez al-Assad staged a military coup and took over from what was a socialist regime. We don't get a lot of details between 1963 and 1971. We don't know what that world was like, but we know from 1971 on, the life of an average Syrian has been pretty terrible. A lot of hallmarks of regimes. He ruled with an iron fist. Anybody who disagreed with the government was killed, maimed, tortured, disappeared. Pick a feature. In 1982 is one of the kind of famous high water marks. They're called the Hama Massacre, in which al-Assad Sr. killed approximately 40,000 of its own people. In the history of countries, let killing their own people be a deterrent for you in terms of good leadership or a proper functioning government. So then in 2000, your one dies and everyone's like, okay, but he's got a son, and the son was trained in the UK. He's an ophthalmologist. Like, surely he's going to be a reformer because he's young and he's lived outside of Syria. And spoiler alert, he's worse than his dad. So for about 10 years, he lay dormant. People, like, there were rumblings is what it kind of sounds like he would kind of get really intense, but like no one was really sure, because when the Arab Spring hit in 2010, the activists, and here, let me pause to explain how this documentary was made, because this is an important point. The documentarian, Yevgeny, the gentleman's name is Yevgeny. He is Russian.
Afanevsky, I think.
Afanevsky. Yeah. Spent about, like, it said like a long time in Syria. I can't remember the exact timing. IMDb. Here we go. He spent months on the ground in Syria, and he used his cameras to craft a comprehensive account. He edited hundreds of hours of footage from activists and citizen journalists, as well as testimony from child protesters, leaders of the revolution, human rights defenders, ordinary citizens, and high-ranking army generals. It was an official selection at the 2017 Sundance Festival. It's won a bunch of awards. Now, from other things I've read, almost all of the raw footage from battles, from bombings, from all of those were cell phone footage from other people. He filmed interviews, and he filmed people walking around sites where violence had happened. But he used other people's videos of violence to tell this story. To us, this is incredibly important because it really, the activists are whose voices are primary here.
He wasn't very present as a filmmaker in a good way.
Yeah.
In that he let the Syrian people tell their story.
Correct.
And it felt very much led by them, not led by the documentary crew.
Correct. And it sounds like the crew was him, which also helps in that it can keep this, like, you can keep himself out of it pretty easily. Also, for us, what this means is that there is explicit consent for for Syrians to tell their own story, which in the terms of conflict storytelling, we are very attuned to. There are lots of stories about Northern Ireland that are not told by Northern Irish people, lots of stories about apartheid, lots of stories about Cambodia, Colombia, the United States, that are not told that do not include the consenting voices of the people. And so it's very important to us that this one does. So anyway, we hear from the activists that as the Arab Spring happened, they had a lot of hope that the revolution was coming to Syria, that they perceived perhaps that Bashar al-Assad, who is the son, that maybe Bashar had a loose grip, that maybe they could pry it out of his hands. So they marched in 2010. There was a lot of hope in 2010. And then in 2011, there was a group of children in a town called Dara or Dara. I'm not sure. Apologies. Our Arabic is terrible. So we're going to butcher a lot of this. I can do Damascus because I was raised in Bible school, but I can't do
That's
most of
all
the
I can
others.
do is Damascus.
So it was in Dara, which I believe is in southern Syria.
Yeah, it's down
by the map.
It's down in the corner of southern
Well,
Syria.
at a school, there were children who spray painted a slogan on the wall of the school, which said, like, "You're next, doctor." And again, doctor was a reference to his former profession. 11-year-olds like to spray paint things. They were turned into the government by their teachers and parents. And like we talk about torture a lot. That word barely scrapes what happened to these children.
They were abducted. They were tortured.
They were mutilated.
Yes, their bodies were extensively mutilated, incarcerated, and most of them were murdered.
So this happened in the spring of 2011, and the people of Syria went, "Oh, hell no," and took to the streets.
My favorite quote was, "The children of Dara were a divine message to the people of Syria."
We get one of the most famous Syrian footballers who becomes a face of, he was the goalkeeper for the Syrian national team. He becomes a face of the revolution.
Yeah, loved him.
It appears Bashar now starts going on television, international television, and saying that anyone who is against him is a terrorist. He starts framing in the international narrative that the Syrian people themselves are terrorists. And so all he is doing is stamping out terrorism. Look at me, I'm such a good Arab leader because there's so much terrorism in the Arab world. Gold star for me. I'm flipping through notes, by the way, because I took about 12 pages of them in this thing because I learned so much.
So much. Yeah, but I think one of the things that's really important to point out at the start of this too is that very similarly to the Arab Spring, they recognized early on in Syria that their best weapon was going to be their cameras. Yes. And so, they talk a little bit about the Arab Spring, and I heard somebody talking about it this weekend in terms of the use of social media, because they were talking about, the current.
Yeah, in the history of Twitter, the Arab Spring needs its own chapter.
Yeah, and it was called the Facebook Revolution because this was before Facebook started really implementing the use of algorithms to control what people saw. And so, you had this opportunity to show the world what was happening. And so they were like, we have cameras in Syria. We can show the world that we're not terrorists, that we're actually just being attacked for taking flowers to military standpoints. And that's a key part to understanding the war, the civil war, and also all the footage that we got as well. To set it up really early on was really potent, so that every time you saw cell phone footage or something, you knew that these were the people trying to document, and very intentionally so. The one wee journalist that ran around in his flak jacket and was just trying to tell the world what was happening. It was really impactful, but it cannot be understated. This wouldn't have happened in Syria until we had cell phones and internet.
Mm-hmm. So they have 500,000 people that join a peaceful demonstration in July of 2011. And the Bashar government responds with armed guards and armed violence. And everything just continues to escalate from there. At one point, the country is so destabilized that it's very easy for ISIS to come in and begin to take over. There are other Islamist militant groups that come in and get strongholds. They appear to be anti-Bashar, or they're very anti the regime. And so they're listening to people to get power. And then the minute you question them, people start dying again. And the Syrian people, over the next hour of this documentary, you're just like, Jesus, what else?
And then and then chemical bombs.
And then Bashar drops chemical bombs. And then the Russians start dropping chemical bombs.
The Russians start dropping bombs, and the Russians aren't adhering to any sort of rules or regulations, and they're using all of these banned weapons, and you're just oh, these poor humans.
And then there's these little moments in there where you're talking to an 11-year-old child who says, oh, I really wanted to go fight. And they didn't, the Free Army, which, okay. So as part of this, right after like in the early days of 2011, a whole host, it looks like, of military members videotape themselves resigning from Bashar's army.
It was so baller. And they all had like this one prepared statement and they all did individual videos and they were just like, no, we're not doing this. We're forming our own army.
We're forming our own army. So they become the Syrian Free Army. And so this little boy at one point is talking about how they won't let you join until you're 15, and how sad he is about that. And then there's another child talking about how they wrote their will after they watched something happen. And like, it's these tiny moments of, well, and then you'll get a face on the screen. Well, then they took my brother and I haven't seen my brother in 5 years. And like all of these, it's very easy, I think, especially because we're used to watching war on screen. We're used to watching war-torn things on screen, that the rhythm of this to remind you that this isn't a Jerry Bruckheimer movie. These are people's cell phones that, like, this was shot on iPhone. Yeah. And here are people's souls that are being destroyed. And here's what this looks like. And it just keeps going. And eventually people start leaving and you start realizing why. And you kind of get the western and northern part of Syria appears from this story and also from maps to be the more populated area of Syria.
Yeah.
And so like ISIL takes a whole lot of control. ISIL takes a whole lot of control of the north and central. Assad, it's all this kind of stuff. So as of this recording, according to Wikipedia, which is, as far as we know, accurate, Assad still controls about 65 to 70% of the
64% of the territory of Syria.
In 2019, the last ISIL stronghold was destroyed, so potentially that's one less problem the Syrian people are facing. Excuse me, those who have remained behind to try to rebuild Syria or win this war, or whatever their particular goal is. There's not really, I read a bunch of things over the weekend of different hypotheses of how much actual emotional support Assad has. There does not, from what I've read, appear to be a consensus about that. If you are somebody watching this and you study Syria and know this dynamic, we have some specific questions. We'd love to talk to you. And it was hard to parse together some of the impacts.
Yeah.
There were lots of things that went through my mind as I watched this. One is, where is everyone getting the guns? Those are really big guns. Where's everyone getting these guns? The other was that this documentary does not touch on the specific gendered aspects of a war in a particularly gendered religion. All religions are gendered, but this one in terms, but a lot of Islam has outwardly gendered practices. They never touched on that. They never touched on sexual assault as a weapon of war, which is generally documented in everything, including in Syria and in the camps in Syria, Free Army members as well as regime members. It doesn't really address orphans or anything else. Like, there's a lot that goes untouched. And so there's a lot more stories to tell. But as two people who we like to consider ourselves fairly educated, we were very confused by this, and we didn't understand. This documentary was a gift to help us give us some context, and now we can kind of chase it.
Yeah.
And chase some more. I mean, you look at Google Syrian documentary, I think there's like 12 pages that come up. So there's lots of people trying to tell this story. And I have lots of theories as to why the world is ignoring it generally. And some of that is covered actually in the first documentary that we do not recommend, but it touches a lot more on some of the European politics of migration. And there is just some flat out resource management issues when it comes to refugees, that Europe was not prepared to have a flood of humans.
No, and at the end of the documentary, they say there's 7 million, as of 2017, there were 7 million Syrians internally displaced, which means inside the boundaries of Syria, and 6 million refugees, 2.5 million of them were children. And you're right that they don't talk about orphans. But for me, the thing that was so profound was every time they talked to a refugee child, it said orphan.
Yeah.
And so, like, this is the reality that, we have 3 million children who are refugees, and how many of them had to leave because their families were killed or their parents were killed, and uncles took them, aunts took them, neighbors took them. And so the scope of destruction, I think, is hard for us to comprehend. As of 2017, almost 500,000 Syrians had been killed. And so those numbers are almost too much for us to comprehend. And, there's a lot of racism that goes into why we don't talk about the death of Black and brown humans around the world. But for me, that was just the scope of the destruction, and displacing that many people is a profound thing to see why that happened. And this documentary is more the why of that happened than the what and the who. And they don't spend a lot of time on the refugees comparatively, but for me it's the more significant because of the why.
Yeah, I think understanding also that this isn't they can't go back home.
No,
they can't,
and they want to. That was the thing for me that the interviews brought too, was that they desperately want to. They love Syria. They think it's beautiful. They love where they're from, and they want it to be peaceful again. But like, just look at the drone footage of Aleppo. Like, humans can't live there.
Mm-mm. We recommend a lot of really hard sits on this channel. This is one of the harder ones.
Mm-hmm.
It is visceral.
Mm-hmm.
It is stark. And it wells a lot of emotions.
It showed everything except a beheading.
Yeah.
And I almost thought it was going to show that. So they do not parse or mince language or video footage.
Now, after the sarin gases dropped, you see exactly what that does to humans' bodies.
Uh-huh.
It felt to me like watching hours of BBC footage, because BBC also never shies away from that. If you've never watched international news coverage, you should know that the way America covers international conflicts and the way that international news covers international conflicts
very different.
Are fundamentally different.
I've never seen so many dead children, and it was
never seen so many dead children in my life.
Really, really hard. Really hard to watch.
It definitely welled a whole lot of postcode privilege guilt for me of, therefore, but I was born in the right place. And learning what to do with that emotion when it comes within me has been a huge part of my journey towards empathy and inclusivity. And I don't know, like, guys, watch it. It's hard. And we're recording this on January the 18th, 2021. A lot of life is hard. A lot of the planet is hard. And we are never shy to say that. But I don't know, like, I looked at my husband when I got home from work after watching this, and I was just like, I'm fine.
I'm fine.
Like, I'm fine. Everyone I love is alive. And no one has bombed my house.
Yeah.
I'm good. And there's a good kind of perspective adjustment that comes from opening yourself up to stories that aren't yours. That I think is very healthy in our increasingly isolated reaction to COVID.
Yeah, and I think, that's the value of continuing to explore other stories, even when there's a lot of stories in our country that also need exploring these days. But for me, there's always value in humanizing and exploring nuance in anything. And for me, in both the documentaries, even though we're not recommending The Born in Syria, to learn things about humans, and to see that, like, in both documentaries, children always play. And like, they, even in the most horrid of circumstances, they will find a way to find joy and to play. And like, I couldn't think of a happier lesson to come from such a horrific, there were lots of sad lessons and anger lessons, and motivations to come from sitting with the Syrian people for 5 hours last week. But that was one of them where I was like, I'm fine, and I should always find time for play and for joy, because it is healing, and it's a really powerful thing. And anytime we can understand why people make the choices that they make and why we should treat people as human beings. There was a part at the end where one of them was like, one of the activists was like, we are your brothers in humanity. Why won't you help us?
Which is the same thing you hear the Rwandans asking during the genocide and Black South Africans asking during apartheid. So,
but yeah, it was one of the harder sits I've done in our Abbey research journey, but we cannot recommend it enough. There's a lot of stories to tell about Syria, so hopefully this will lead you, as it has led us, down rabbit holes of learning more about what seems to be a very beautiful country.
We wish hope and rest and play and joy for those who have been displaced by this. We're incredibly grateful to all the people that have dedicated their lives to serving refugees. We have a family friend who's doing it, and the stories that she shares are mind-boggling. The human capacity for resiliency is humbling.
Yeah.
And there's lots of places to get involved. We'll make sure to put a few in the show notes if you'd like to learn more from a nonprofit perspective, and maybe get your hands dirty a little bit in helping these folks get basic human needs like toothbrushes, because that's still a pretty big need. In the meantime, we'll see you next week when we're going to talk about a very different vibe of the emotional part, much more the emotional part of immigration, the emotional part of assimilation versus culture and all of that. Yeah. All that stuff, a little bit more away from the physical safety aspects of immigration and more towards the emotions when we talk about the namesake with Cal Penn.
We're looking forward to it.
And we'll see you then.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.